I used to work as a night security guard in an office building in downtown Chicago. This was about 6 years ago when I was still in my mid-20s. The building wasn't one of those massive skyscrapers, but it was big enough. About 20 floors, mostly offices for law firms, financial companies, and a couple of tech startups. It was one of those older buildings that had been renovated a few times, but still had that slightly outdated feel. The floors had narrow hallways, and at night the place always felt kind of eerie. The job was pretty straightforward. Most nights my duties were to do rounds on each floor, make sure no one was around, and check that all the doors were locked. My partner, Derek, worked with me during most shifts. We'd start around 10 p.m. and go until 6 a.m. It was easy money, though the hours could get long, and it wasn't uncommon to go an entire night without seeing anyone, especially on the higher floors. Most people cleared out by 7 or 8 p.m., leaving the place empty for the night. I got used to the routine pretty quickly. I wasn't a fan of the quiet at first, but you learn to block it out. The office spaces were pretty typical. Cubicles, conference rooms, break areas, the usual. We had access to all the floors and a couple of cameras in key areas, but the building wasn't super high-tech when it came to security. Derek and I usually split the rounds. He'd start on the lower floors and I'd take the top half. We kept in touch using our radios, but honestly, there wasn't much to report most of the time. Sometimes we'd meet up halfway through a shift, hang out in the lobby, and shoot the breeze. There wasn't a lot of excitement, but it was easy work and we got used to the pace. One night, things started feeling off. It was a Tuesday around 1 a.m. and I had just finished my rounds on the top floors. I was heading back down when I realized I hadn't heard from Derek in a while. We'd usually check in every 20, 30 minutes just to make sure everything was cool, but it had been over an hour since I last heard from him. I figured maybe he was just on one of the lower floors or had gotten distracted with something. No big deal. I grabbed my radio and called him, but there was no response. That wasn't totally unusual either. Sometimes the radios would cut out, especially if one of us was in the basement or near the stairwells where the signal wasn't great. I didn't think much of it, but after a few more attempts to reach him, I started getting a little annoyed. I was tired, and the last thing I wanted was to do extra rounds if Derek had decided to take a break somewhere. I went down to the first floor to check the cameras. We had a small room off the lobby with a few screens that showed feeds from the stairwells, elevators, and entrances. When I got there, I quickly realized something strange. I could see Derek on the camera entering one of the stairwells on the 4th floor about 45 minutes earlier, but I hadn't seen him leave. The footage just showed him walking into the stairwell, and then nothing. I watched the feed for a few minutes, trying to see if maybe I had missed him coming out, but the door never opened again. I figured maybe he had taken the stairs down to the basement or something, but it didn't explain why he wasn't answering his radio. I was getting more frustrated than worried at this point, so I decided to check it out myself. I grabbed a flashlight from the security office and headed up to the 4th floor. The elevator ride up was slow, and by the time I reached the floor, I was getting that weird sense of isolation that only comes when you realize how completely alone you are in a building that size. When I got to the 4th floor, it was dead silent. Most of the lights were on timers, so the hallway was dim, with only a few emergency lights flickering overhead. I walked toward the stairwell where Derek had last been seen on the cameras. The door was slightly ajar, which I thought was strange. We were supposed to keep all the stairwell doors closed, even during rounds. I pushed it open and shone my flashlight down the stairs. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just a typical narrow stairwell that spiraled down toward the lower levels. I called out for Derek again, but the sound of my voice just echoed off the walls. At this point, I was starting to feel uneasy. Derek was a solid guy, not the type to just disappear without saying something. I thought maybe he had gotten sick or hurt, so I decided to head down the stairs, figuring I'd run into him eventually. As I descended, I kept expecting to hear footsteps or some sign of life, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of the building's HVAC system. The stairwell felt claustrophobic, like it was closing in on me the further I went down. When I reached the basement level, I found the door to the maintenance area open. That wasn't unusual, as we often had to check in there for various reasons: water leaks, electrical issues, that sort of thing. I stepped inside and immediately felt a chill. The basement was always colder than the rest of the building, but this was different. It felt unnaturally cold. I walked through the dimly lit corridor, passing rows of old, rusted lockers and maintenance equipment. The whole place had this musty, metallic smell that made me feel uneasy. As I moved further in, I noticed something strange. Derek's flashlight was lying on the ground near the far wall, its light flickering weakly. I rushed over to it, but Derek wasn't there. His flashlight was just sitting there, abandoned. I picked it up and called out again, louder this time, but there was no response. The place felt completely dead. At this point, my heart was racing. I couldn't figure out where Derek had gone. It didn't make sense. He wouldn't just leave his flashlight like that, and there was no sign of him anywhere. I checked every room in the basement, every nook and cranny, but he was gone. I went back to the stairwell and started calling his name again, this time over the radio too, but there was just static. I climbed the stairs back up to the first floor, trying to think of what to do next. I wasn't about to call the police or anything. I didn't want to overreact, but I was seriously starting to get freaked out. When I got back to the security office, I checked the cameras again. There was still no sign of Derek. The feed from the stairwell showed the same thing. Derek going in but never coming out. I scanned through the footage from all the other floors, but there was nothing. He had just vanished. I sat there for a while, staring at the monitors, trying to come up with some kind of explanation. Maybe he had left the building without me noticing. But that didn't make sense either. There were cameras at every exit, and I hadn't seen him leave. The rest of the night dragged on in a blur. I kept checking the cameras, walking the floors, calling out for Derek, but there was no sign of him. Eventually, my shift ended, and I handed everything over to the day shift guard without saying anything about what had happened. I didn't even know how to explain it. I tried calling Derek's phone after I got home, but it went straight to voicemail. Later that day, I got a call from my supervisor asking if I had seen Derek. Apparently, he never made it home, and no one could get in touch with him. They asked me if anything strange had happened during the night, but I didn't know what to say. I told them about the last time I saw him on the cameras, but I left out the part about the basement. I didn't want to sound crazy. The next few days were a blur. The police got involved, but there wasn't much they could do. They checked the building, questioned everyone who worked there, but nothing turned up. Derek had just disappeared. I ended up quitting the job a couple of weeks later. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with that building. It wasn't just about Derek disappearing. There was something off about the whole place. I never went back after that. The police never found anything, and Derek was never seen again. About 5 years ago, I was working the closing shift at a restaurant in downtown Cincinnati. It was one of those small, family-owned places that stayed open late to catch the after-bar crowd. So most nights, we'd wrap up around 2 or 3 a.m. It wasn't a bad gig. I was in my early 20s, and it was just something to pay the bills while I figured out what I really wanted to do. The job itself was pretty routine. Prep in the afternoon, serve through dinner, and then once the late-night rush was over, we'd close up. The kitchen staff would start cleaning, and I'd restock the walk-in freezer for the next day. The walk-in was this huge metal room in the back of the kitchen, a little smaller than a garage, with shelves on all sides packed with food. We kept everything in there: frozen meat, vegetables, desserts, you name it. I'd been doing it for months, so it was just another part of the job, nothing I really thought about. That night wasn't any different. It was a Wednesday, so we weren't super busy, and by around 1:30 a.m. we were already starting to clean up. Most of the kitchen staff had left by then, so it was just me and one other guy, Ray, who was washing dishes. The restaurant itself was dead silent. The kind of quiet you only get after midnight when everyone's gone home and the streets are empty. I was restocking the freezer like I always did, moving boxes around and making sure everything was organized for the morning shift. The freezer door was one of those heavy industrial doors that latch shut when you close it, but there's an emergency release on the inside, so if it accidentally locks, you can still get out. I never thought much of it because I'd never had a problem before. I'd been in and out of that freezer hundreds of times without anything happening. But that night, something felt off. I was stacking some boxes of frozen vegetables on the top shelf when I heard the door behind me slam shut. It wasn't a slow creak or a gentle close. It was a full-on slam, like someone had yanked it shut hard. I froze for a second, confused. I hadn't heard anyone else in the kitchen, and I was pretty sure Ray was still by the sink dealing with the dishes. At first, I didn't panic. I figured maybe Ray had come back there to grab something and didn't realize I was inside. The door didn't lock automatically, so I could just open it and go back to work. But when I tried to push the door open, it didn't budge. That's when I started to get a little concerned. I pushed harder, thinking maybe something had gotten caught in the door or it was just stuck, but it still wouldn't move. I could hear the faint hum of the restaurant's freezer fans, the sound filling the small room as I stood there, suddenly aware of how cold it was. I pounded on the door, calling out for Ray, but the metal walls muffled the sound, and I wasn't sure if he could even hear me. I tried the emergency release next, grabbing the handle and yanking on it, but it didn't do anything. I pulled again, harder this time, but it was like the door was welded shut. My stomach started to tighten. This wasn't normal. I pounded on the door again, shouting this time, hoping Ray would hear me. I couldn't understand how the door had slammed so hard, and why I couldn't get it open now. I'd heard about walk-in freezer accidents, but they always seemed like something that happened to someone else, in some other place. Minutes passed, and there was still no sign of Ray. The cold was starting to seep into my skin. Even though I had on a thick chef's coat, it wasn't enough for the temperature inside the freezer. I kept trying to get the door open, kicking it, slamming my shoulder into it, anything to make it budge, but it just stayed shut. I glanced around the small room, my breath coming out in visible puffs now. I realized that there were no other ways out, no windows, no extra exits, just me, stuck inside this giant metal box. My heart started pounding faster, and my mind raced through all the things I'd heard about people getting trapped in freezers. It didn't take long for the cold to do real damage. I wasn't dressed for it, and there wasn't exactly a stash of blankets or anything I could use to keep warm. I shouted for Ray again, my fists banging against the door, but it was still dead silent outside. I checked my phone, hoping maybe I could call him, but I had no signal. Of course. The freezer was lined with thick metal walls, so it was like being in a Faraday cage, no chance of calling for help. I started pacing around the freezer, trying to stay warm. My legs were shaking a little now, the cold creeping into my bones. I thought about everything that could be happening outside. Maybe Ray had gone to the bathroom, or maybe he'd finished up and left without checking to see if I was still in the kitchen. The minutes felt like hours. I kept moving, banging on the door every few minutes, but there was still nothing. The worst part was the quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the freezer, a constant reminder that I was stuck in here with no one coming to get me. At some point, I don't even know how long it had been, I thought I heard something outside the freezer door. It was faint, almost like footsteps. I stood still, listening, my breath coming in shallow gasps from the cold. The steps seemed to get closer, but then they stopped. I banged on the door again, shouting Ray's name, but there was no response. The footsteps never returned, and I didn't hear anything else. For a second, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I huddled in the corner of the freezer, trying to keep my body heat in, but I could feel myself getting colder and colder. My fingers were numb and my toes were starting to hurt. I couldn't stop shaking. Eventually, I heard the door handle rattle and the door swung open. Ray was standing there looking confused and half asleep. He asked what I was doing in there and why I hadn't just opened the door. I tried to explain that I couldn't, that it had been stuck and the emergency release wasn't working, but he didn't seem to understand. He said he had just finished up and was about to leave when he remembered I was restocking the freezer. He swore he hadn't heard me yelling or banging on the door. I couldn't figure out what had happened. The door worked fine when he opened it, The release was functioning like it always had. There was no reason it should have been stuck. I was shaking so bad that I had to sit down for a while. Ray didn't seem too bothered by what had happened, but I couldn't shake how close I had come to being trapped in there for hours. If Ray hadn't remembered I was in the freezer before leaving, I don't know what would have happened. I went home that night still trying to figure it out. How had the door slammed shut like that? Why hadn't the emergency release worked when I needed it? I couldn't get any straight answers, and the next day, everything was back to normal. I kept working at the restaurant for another few months after that, but every time I had to go into that freezer, I felt a knot in my stomach. I never had another issue with the door, and it never slammed shut on me again. But that night stuck with me. About 6 years ago, I worked as a toll booth operator on the night shift at one of the main toll plazas in upstate New York, just outside of Albany. It wasn't an exciting job, but it was easy and paid decent enough for the overnight hours. I'd sit in this small, cramped booth for 8 hours, collecting tolls from the occasional car that came through. It was a pretty rural area, so after 10 p.m., traffic would slow down significantly, and by midnight, I'd maybe get a car every 10 or 15 minutes. Most of the time, it was quiet, really quiet. The booth itself was nothing special, just a small glass structure with enough room for a desk, a chair, and a heater to keep you warm in the winter. I had a radio to pass the time, a small black and white TV that barely picked up any channels, and my phone, but service was spotty. I'd spend most nights flipping through the same 3 stations on the TV or scrolling through my phone, just trying to stay awake. For the first few months, the job was uneventful. It was exactly what I expected. Just long, boring nights where I'd occasionally collect tolls and chat with the drivers for a few seconds before they drove off. Most people were friendly, just passing through on their way to or from work, but every now and then I'd get a truck driver who barely grunted a word at me, or someone who seemed like they'd been driving for hours and couldn't even keep their eyes open. But then, one night, this guy started showing up. It was around 1 a.m. and I was halfway through my shift when he pulled up in an old beat-up sedan. The car itself wasn't unusual. Lots of people drive junkers through the tolls, but it was the way he acted that threw me off. He didn't roll down his window at first. He just sat there staring at me through the glass. I could see him clearly under the fluorescent lights of the toll plaza. Middle-aged, maybe in his 50s, with thinning hair and a worn-out jacket. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were locked on me. After a few awkward seconds, he finally rolled down his window and handed me the exact change for the toll. He didn't say a word, didn't even look at me as I took the money. I handed him his receipt and he drove off without a glance. I figured maybe he was just tired or having a bad night, so I didn't think much of it. The next night he showed up again. Same car, same time, same stare. He pulled up to my booth, just sitting there for a few seconds before handing me the exact change again. This time he didn't even roll down the window all the way, just enough to pass the money through. Again, no words, no expression, just that blank stare before he drove off. This went on for a few nights. Every night at almost exactly 1 a.m., he'd show up, hand me the change, and leave. At first, I thought it was just a weird coincidence. Some people drive the same routes at the same time every day, but after a week of this, it started to get under my skin. The way he stared at me felt off. Like he wasn't just looking at me, but studying me, waiting for something. One night, I decided to try to break the silence. When he pulled up, I said a quick, "Hey, how's it going?" as I took his money. He didn't respond. He didn't even blink. Just handed me the cash and stared. It was unsettling to say the least. After that, I started dreading the moment he'd pull up. I'd sit in the booth constantly checking the clock, waiting for 1 a.m. to roll around. It was like I knew he'd be there, and sure enough, he always was. It wasn't like he did anything threatening, but something about the way he acted felt wrong. Then, one night, things escalated. It was a little after 1 a.m. and I had just finished with another driver when I saw the headlights of his car approaching. By this point, I was getting anxious every time I saw him. But this time, instead of just sitting in his car and staring at me like usual, he pulled up to the booth and stopped further back than normal. The window was rolled down, but he wasn't handing me the money right away. He just sat there, staring, like always. I waited for him to pass me the cash, but he didn't move. I could feel my skin prickling with unease. I tried to keep my cool, but my heart was racing. After what felt like forever, he finally spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, and it took me a second to register what he was saying. He started telling me things, personal things. At first I thought he was just making small talk, but then he mentioned my apartment. He knew what street I lived on, even the color of my car. He told me what time I usually got home after my shift. My stomach dropped. I had never seen this guy outside of the toll booth, and I sure as hell had never told him where I lived or what my routine was. He kept talking, listing off details about my life like he'd been watching me for weeks. He knew the exact route I took home. He even mentioned the grocery store I stopped at sometimes on my way back. My hands started shaking, and I had to force myself to stay calm. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there, frozen, trying not to show how freaked out I was. After what felt like an eternity, he finally handed me the money and drove off, leaving me standing there, stunned. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the cops, but what would I even say? He hadn't threatened me directly, but the way he spoke made it clear that he'd been following me, watching me. The next night I considered calling in sick, but I couldn't afford to miss a shift. I figured maybe it was a one-time thing, that he'd gotten whatever he needed to say off his chest and I wouldn't see him again. But of course I was wrong. He came back the next night and the night after that. Each time he gave me more details, more information about my life. He talked about things I did on my days off, places I'd been, people I'd seen. It was like he had a front row seat to my entire life. I started getting paranoid. I'd double-check my locks every time I left the house, and I'd change my route to and from work, hoping to throw him off. But somehow he always seemed to know where I was. One night, I snapped. When he pulled up and started talking, I cut him off, telling him to stop following me, to leave me alone. He didn't react. He just stared at me with that same blank expression, like he didn't understand what I was saying. I didn't know what else to do, so I filed a report with the local police. They took down the details, but without any real evidence or a direct threat, there wasn't much they could do. They told me they'd keep an eye on the area, but I didn't feel any safer. I started dreading my shifts, feeling trapped in that little booth with nowhere to go if things escalated. The worst part was that the guy never stopped coming. Even after I'd reported him, he'd still show up night after night, just watching me. I tried to act like it didn't bother me, but inside I was terrified. I couldn't figure out why he was doing it, what he wanted from me. He never asked for anything, never tried to get out of his car. He just kept talking, telling me more and more about my own life. After a while, I started seeing him in other places too. I'd be out grocery shopping or grabbing food, and I'd spot him across the parking lot, sitting in his car, watching me. He never approached, but just knowing he was there was enough to send my anxiety through the roof. I couldn't go anywhere without looking over my shoulder, checking to see if he was following me. One night I'd had enough. I quit the job. I couldn't take it anymore, being stuck in that booth, feeling like I was being hunted. I didn't give a reason to my boss. I just told him I was done and never went back. I used to work overnight shifts at a 24-hour convenience store in Pittsburgh, a few miles outside the downtown area. This was about 4 or 5 years ago when I was trying to save up some money after college. It was one of those places that never seemed to close, no matter the weather, holidays, or what time of night it was. I mostly worked by myself from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and it wasn't the worst job in the world. Pittsburgh's a big enough city, but at night, especially during the week, things slow down a lot, and the store was usually pretty quiet after midnight. The store itself was small, one of those older corner stores with narrow aisles and shelves packed tight with snacks, drinks, basic groceries, and cigarettes. We also had a small stockroom in the back where we kept extra supplies, but nothing major. The kind of place people stop in when they're coming home late from work or a night out, grabbing a soda or some snacks on their way back to their apartment. Most nights were pretty routine. You get the occasional drunk person or late-night regulars, but overall it was pretty uneventful. The store was in a relatively safe neighborhood, so I wasn't too worried about anything happening. I'd just put on some music or a podcast to pass the time between customers, ring people up, and clean up when it was quiet. One night, though, things started getting weird. It was around 2 a.m. and I hadn't had a customer in over an hour. That wasn't too unusual, especially on a weeknight. I was restocking some shelves near the front of the store when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A few items, bags of chips, a couple of candy bars, were missing from one of the aisles. I hadn't seen anyone come in or leave, and I hadn't restocked that aisle recently, so I couldn't figure out how things had disappeared. At first, I thought maybe I just hadn't noticed the shelves were already a little bare, or maybe I'd misplaced something earlier in the night. I shrugged it off and continued working. A little while later, I heard a noise coming from the back of the store, near the stockroom. It sounded like something falling, a light thud, nothing too loud but enough to make me look up. The stockroom door was open, which was odd because I was sure I had closed it earlier. I walked over to check it out, figuring something had fallen off a shelf or maybe a box had tipped over. When I got to the stockroom, everything looked normal. A few boxes of snacks were stacked up, some extra drinks on the side, but nothing seemed out of place. The weird part was, I hadn't been back there all night, so I had no idea how the door had opened. I chalked it up to maybe a draft or something. It was an old building, and sometimes the doors didn't close all the way unless you gave them a good push. A couple of hours went by, and nothing else happened. I had a few customers come in, grabbed a coffee, rang them up, and that was it, but I couldn't shake the weird feeling that something was off. It wasn't until around 4:30 a.m. when I was finishing up some paperwork behind the counter that I noticed more items missing from the shelves. This time it was some energy drinks and a few snack bars. I knew for a fact that no one had come in or gone near that section of the store in the last hour. The security camera over the entrance would have caught anyone walking in or out, and the place was small enough that I would have seen someone wandering around. I started to get a little freaked out. There was no way stuff was just disappearing on its own. I checked the security footage, starting with the cameras covering the aisles. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The footage showed me restocking, a few customers coming in, buying stuff, and leaving. But when I rewound to earlier in the night, something strange happened. Around the time I heard that noise from the stockroom, I noticed movement on the camera. At first, I thought it was just the video glitching, but then I saw it. Someone had come into the store, but they weren't walking through the entrance like normal. They were slipping out of the stockroom. The camera angle wasn't great, so I couldn't make out much, but it was clearly a person. They were ducking behind the shelves, staying low and moving quietly through the aisles, grabbing stuff off the shelves when I wasn't looking. My heart sank. Someone had been inside the store with me the whole time, sneaking around while I was working. I rewound the footage further and saw them again. Whoever it was, they had slipped into the store hours earlier, probably when I was distracted by a customer or restocking something in the back. They had been hiding in the stockroom for who knows how long. I kept watching, hoping to catch a clearer glimpse of their face, but they were careful to stay out of the camera's direct view. The figure was wearing dark clothes, a hoodie pulled up over their head, and they moved fast, staying out of sight whenever I was nearby. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. This wasn't just some random shoplifter grabbing a candy bar and running out. This person was hiding in the store, waiting for the right moment to steal things without being seen. But the more I watched, the more it became clear that they weren't just stealing random snacks. They were watching me too. In the footage, I could see them peeking around corners, slipping into aisles right after I left, and staying just out of view whenever I was nearby. I couldn't believe I hadn't noticed them sooner. The thought that someone had been in the store with me, silently watching, waiting for their moment, made me feel sick. I didn't know what to do. Calling the cops felt pointless at that moment. There wasn't much they could do after the fact. I locked the stockroom door and tried to focus on finishing my shift. but every sound, every little movement in the corner of my eye had me on edge. For the next few nights, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I was hyper-aware of every little sound in the store, constantly checking the stockroom to make sure it was locked and reviewing the security footage more often than I should have. I even started keeping my phone on me at all times, just in case I needed to call for help. Then, about a week later, it happened again. It was around the same time, early in the morning, just before my shift ended. I was in the middle of stocking shelves near the front of the store when I heard something behind me. It was faint, but it was there. A soft shuffle, like someone moving quickly through the aisles. I spun around, but there was no one there. I checked the stockroom door, and sure enough, it was open again. My heart started pounding. I had locked it earlier that night. I knew I had. I grabbed my phone and slowly made my way to the back of the store, every nerve in my body on high alert. When I reached the stockroom, I hesitated before stepping inside. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but the thought of someone hiding in there waiting made my skin crawl. I turned on the light and stepped in. The room was empty, just like before. No signs of anyone being in there, nothing out of place. But I knew something was wrong. The door didn't just open on its own. I double-checked the security cameras later, and there it was again, that same figure slipping out of the stockroom when I wasn't looking, grabbing things off the shelves and staying just out of sight. They knew exactly when I wasn't paying attention, exactly when to move so I wouldn't catch them. It was like they had memorized my routine, figured out when I would be distracted. This went on for weeks. Every few nights, more stuff would go missing. Small things, nothing major, but enough to make me notice. And every time I checked the footage, I'd see that figure darting around the store, always staying just out of reach. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. The constant feeling of being watched, the knowledge that someone was in the store with me, messing with me. It was too much. I quit the job and moved on, but I still think about it sometimes. I never figured out who it was or why they were doing it. Part of me thinks it was just some desperate person stealing to get by. But another part of me can't shake the feeling that it was something more, something personal. I don't work alone at night anymore. The idea of being stuck in another empty building, not knowing who might be hiding just out of sight, is something I can't deal with. A few years ago, I was working as a nurse on the night shift at a small hospital in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It wasn't a huge place, more like a local hospital where people came in for minor emergencies, routine surgeries, or if they needed care before being transferred to a bigger facility in the city. There was nothing flashy about it, just your typical small-town hospital with a couple of wings, some specialty departments, and a small emergency room. Most of the time, my nights were pretty slow. It would be me and a few other nurses on the floor, handling the patients who needed overnight care or the occasional emergency that came in during the dead of night. There were fewer staff on at night, so it was quieter and most of the patients were asleep or resting, which made the shifts drag sometimes. I'd usually find things to do to keep myself busy, checking on patients, doing paperwork, or helping the other nurses with anything they needed. There was this one patient, though, that changed everything. His name was Mr. Henson. He was an older man, maybe in his mid-70s, and he had been admitted a couple of days earlier with some kind of heart problem. I wasn't his primary nurse, but I had checked on him a few times, and he seemed like a nice enough guy. Quiet, polite, always keeping to himself. He wasn't in great shape, but he wasn't critical either. The doctors had been keeping a close eye on him, and they were trying to stabilize him before deciding if he needed to be transferred to a bigger hospital for surgery. It was a Tuesday night, and I was working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, like usual. The hospital was quiet, quieter than usual actually. We didn't have a lot of patients that night, so there wasn't much going on. I was making my rounds, checking on the patients in my wing, and when I got to Mr. Henson's room, something felt off. The room was completely empty. I stood there for a second, just staring at the bed. It was neatly made, like no one had even been in it. The lights were dim, and the machines by the bedside, the ones monitoring his heart rate and vitals, were turned off. It didn't make sense. I had seen him earlier in the night, and he had been fine. He wasn't scheduled to be discharged or moved, and as far as I knew, there were no plans to transfer him. I double-checked the patient list to make sure I wasn't mistaken, but Mr. Henson was definitely supposed to be in that room. There was no mention of him being moved or discharged, and no one had told me anything about it. I headed back to the nurse's station and asked the other nurse on duty, Jess, if she knew where Mr. Henson had gone. She looked at me like I was crazy. She hadn't heard anything about him being moved either. We checked the system, but there was no record of him being transferred or discharged. His chart still showed him as being admitted, with no updates. That's when things started to get weird. We checked with the charge nurse to see if maybe she had moved him to a different room, but she hadn't heard anything either. None of the other nurses or doctors knew where he had gone. We even checked with the security staff to see if they had seen him leave, but they hadn't. It was like he had just disappeared. Jess and I went back to his room to look around, hoping we'd find something, anything, that would explain where he had gone. The room was exactly how I had left it earlier in the night. The bed was perfectly made, the machines were off, and there was no sign that anyone had been in there recently. We checked the bathroom, the closet, even the small storage area down the hall, but there was no sign of Mr. Henson. I started to feel this growing sense of unease. Patients don't just disappear from a hospital, especially not someone in Mr. Henson's condition. He wasn't mobile enough to get up and walk out on his own, and even if he had, someone would have noticed. Jess suggested that maybe there had been some kind of mix-up with his records, so we went back to the nurse's station to check the logs again. We pulled up the security footage from the hallway outside his room, hoping we'd see something that would explain what had happened. We watched the footage from earlier in the night, around the time I had last checked on him. There he was, lying in bed just like I remembered. He wasn't moving much, just resting. The footage showed the usual, me coming in and out of his room, checking his vitals and then leaving. But as the footage rolled on, something strange happened. Around 1:30 a.m., the door to his room opened, but no one came in or out. It was just open. The footage showed the door standing open for a few minutes, and then, without any movement on the camera, the door slowly closed again. That was it. There was no sign of Mr. Henson leaving the room, no one else going in or out. It was like the door had just opened and closed by itself. We replayed the footage several times, but there was nothing else. No explanation for why the door had opened, or where Mr. Henson had gone. By now it was close to 3 a.m., and Jess and I were both getting pretty freaked out. We started checking every inch of the hospital, looking for any trace of Mr. Henson. We checked every floor, every room, even the stairwells and exits. But there was nothing. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The next morning we reported what had happened to the day shift nurses and the hospital administration. They launched an investigation, but nothing ever came of it. There was no record of Mr. Henson being transferred, discharged, or even leaving the hospital. His family was contacted, but they hadn't heard from him either. The police were brought in, but they couldn't find any evidence of foul play or an escape. It was like Mr. Henson had just disappeared off the face of the earth. For weeks after that night, the hospital was buzzing with rumors about what had happened to him. Some people thought he had wandered off on his own, but I didn't buy that. He wasn't in any condition to walk, let alone leave the hospital without anyone noticing. Others speculated that there had been some kind of paperwork mistake, but that didn't explain the empty room or the missing security footage. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I walked past Mr. Henson's old room, I felt this weird sense of unease, like something was still lingering there. The room stayed empty for a while after he disappeared, almost like no one wanted to use it. Eventually, things went back to normal at the hospital. The staff stopped talking about Mr. Henson, and the room was reassigned to another patient. But I never forgot about that night. It still haunts me, the way he just vanished without a trace. There was no logical explanation for it, and that's what bothers me the most. I don't work at that hospital anymore. I left a couple of years later to take a job at a bigger hospital in the city. But every now and then, I think about Mr. Henson and wonder what really happened to him. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, trying to figure out if there was something I missed, some clue that would explain his disappearance. But there's nothing. I'll probably never know what happened to him, and that's the scariest part. It's not the idea that he's gone. It's the fact that he disappeared in a place where things like that aren't supposed to happen. I used to work as a janitor at a huge shopping mall in Dallas. It wasn't one of the high-end malls with designer stores, just a regular place where people went to grab groceries or hit up chain stores. The pay wasn't great, but the hours worked for me since I preferred the night shift. The mall closed around 10 p.m., and by the time I finished my rounds, it would be close to midnight or 1 a.m. The job itself was pretty straightforward. After the mall closed, I would go around cleaning the floors, taking out the trash, making sure the bathrooms were stocked, and tidying up any mess left by the last-minute shoppers. It was boring most nights, but it was peaceful in its own way. I'd put in my headphones and zone out while pushing a mop around or emptying trash bins. There were a couple of security guards on duty during the night, but most of the time I barely saw them. They'd hang out in their little office near the entrance, watching the security cameras or doing their own rounds. The mall was big enough that we rarely crossed paths unless something needed attention. We had walkie-talkies though, just in case there was an issue. One night, a few months into the job, things started getting weird. It was a normal weeknight and I was finishing up my last few tasks in the food court area. The mall had been closed for about an hour and the place was dead quiet, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional clatter of my cleaning supplies. I was about to head toward the loading dock to take out the last bag of trash when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. At the far end of the food court, near one of the big glass doors leading to the parking lot, there was a guy just standing there. He wasn't moving, just standing in the shadows, staring in my direction. I stopped for a second, not sure if I was seeing things. The mall was supposed to be locked up, and no one should have been inside, especially not at that time of night. I thought maybe it was one of the security guards, but even from a distance, I could tell this guy wasn't wearing a uniform. He looked like a regular person, jeans, dark jacket, and a baseball cap. My first instinct was that he was a homeless guy who had slipped in before closing, maybe looking for a place to stay for the night. That wasn't unheard of, especially in a big mall like this. I called over the walkie-talkie to one of the guards, letting them know there was someone in the food court, and they said they'd check it out. I didn't want to confront the guy directly. I wasn't exactly trained for that kind of thing, but I kept an eye on him while I continued working, just to make sure he didn't try anything. A few minutes later, one of the guards, Mike, showed up. He walked over to the spot where I had seen the guy, but by the time he got there, the guy was gone. Mike looked around, checked the nearby exits, but there was no sign of anyone. He told me not to worry, that maybe I had just seen something in the reflection of the glass, or maybe the guy had slipped out one of the side doors. The mall had a lot of entrances and exits, and it wouldn't have been hard for someone to sneak out without being noticed. I didn't think much of it after that. Mike made another round of the mall, checking all the doors to make sure they were locked, and everything seemed fine. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, I was cleaning one of the bathrooms on the second floor, near the back of the mall. The place was deserted, and I was just about done when I saw someone walk past the entrance to the bathroom. It was quick, just a flash of movement, but I knew I saw someone. I stuck my head out into the hallway, but the corridor was empty. I called it into security again, and once again they came to check it out, but there was no sign of anyone. The cameras didn't catch anything either. It was weird, but I figured maybe it was the same guy from before and he was just sneaking around. I made a mental note to be more careful, but after a few days of nothing happening, I kind of forgot about it. Then things started getting worse. A week or so after that, I was working late again, cleaning one of the back hallways near the loading docks. It was one of those areas where no one really goes unless they work at the mall. dimly lit, narrow, with lots of storage rooms and staff entrances. I was sweeping up some trash when I felt like someone was behind me. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. I kept working, but every few minutes, I'd get that same feeling, like someone was watching me, or like they were just out of sight, hiding around the corner. It got so bad that I ended up leaving the area early and going back to the main part of the mall to finish up. I figured I was just being paranoid, but it was hard to shake the feeling. The last straw came a couple of nights later. It was close to 1 a.m. and I was finishing up my shift. I had just taken the last bag of trash out to the dumpster behind the mall, and I was walking back through the parking lot to my car. The lot was huge, mostly empty except for a few cars belonging to the security guards and some of the night staff. The street lights cast long shadows, and the air was quiet, too quiet. As I was walking, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, movement near my car. I stopped and looked, squinting in the dim light, and saw the same guy from the food court. He was standing next to my car, just watching me. I froze. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, his face obscured by the shadows and the brim of his baseball cap. I was too far away to see his face clearly, but I could tell it was the same guy, the same jacket, the same stance. My heart was racing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to confront him, but I couldn't just stand there either. I pulled out my phone and started walking quickly back toward the mall entrance, calling the security guards as I went. By the time they got out to the parking lot, the guy was gone. They searched the area, but there was no sign of him. No one else had seen him, and the cameras didn't catch anything. That night, I drove home with my heart still pounding, checking my rearview mirror the whole way. I couldn't stop thinking about how he had been standing there waiting for me. It wasn't like he had just been wandering around. He had been watching me specifically, and it felt like he had been planning something. After that, I couldn't relax at work anymore. Every sound, every shadow made me jump. I started parking my car closer to the entrance, and I asked the security guards to walk me out to my car at the end of my shifts. I didn't want to admit how scared I was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the guy was still out there, watching me, waiting for another chance. For the next few weeks, nothing happened. I kept my head down, finished my shifts as quickly as I could, and left without looking back. The security guards told me they hadn't seen anything suspicious, and they assured me the mall was secure, but I wasn't convinced. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I quit the job and found something else, something during the day where I didn't have to worry about who might be lurking in the shadows. About 3 years ago, I was working as a cleaner at a high school in Cleveland. It wasn't a bad job, just the usual stuff, cleaning classrooms, bathrooms, hallways, and making sure everything was in order before the next day. I worked the evening shift, starting around 3 p.m. and usually finishing up around 11 p.m. By the time I was done, the building was pretty much empty, save for a few late-working teachers or maybe a janitor here and there. The school itself was an older building, the kind with creaky floors and narrow hallways, with a layout that never quite made sense. You could get turned around easily if you didn't know where you were going. Most of the classrooms had big windows that looked out over the parking lot or the football field, but a few of the rooms, especially the ones in the older wings, felt more like they were cut off from the rest of the school. It could get creepy when you were the last one there, walking through the dimly lit halls with only the sound of your footsteps echoing around. One night, it was probably around 9 p.m., I was doing my rounds, making sure everything was locked up. The school had been quiet that evening, no after-school activities or events, so I hadn't seen anyone for a couple of hours. I was in the science wing, finishing up the last few rooms when I realized my keys were missing. I had this big, jangly set of keys that opened every door in the school. Classrooms, storage closets, staff rooms, everything. It was impossible not to notice when they were gone because I carried them on this heavy metal ring that jingled every time I moved. I always kept them hooked onto my belt loop, so I couldn't figure out how they could have gone missing. I started retracing my steps, thinking maybe I'd left them in one of the classrooms or dropped them somewhere in the hall. The last room I had cleaned was a biology lab, so I headed back there first, figuring I'd find them on one of the counters or near the sink where I'd been scrubbing. But when I got there, the room was empty, just as I'd left it. No keys. I was starting to get frustrated. I'd only been in a few rooms that evening, and I knew I hadn't gone far, so the keys had to be somewhere. I backtracked through every classroom, checking under desks, on shelves, and even in the trash cans, thinking maybe I'd accidentally tossed them. Still nothing. The weird part was, I distinctly remembered having them when I started cleaning the science wing. I could picture myself locking up one of the classrooms before moving on to the next one, so how had they just disappeared? After searching for a good half hour, I started feeling a little uneasy. The school was empty by this point, and I was completely alone. The only light was from the emergency exit signs and the occasional flickering fluorescent in the hallway. I kept expecting to hear the familiar jingle of my keys echoing through the hall, but all I could hear was my own footsteps and the distant hum of the ventilation system. I was about to give up and head back to the janitor's closet to grab the spare keys when I noticed something strange. As I walked past one of the older classrooms in the far corner of the building, I saw a small glint of metal hanging on a hook by the door. It was my keys. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured maybe I'd absent-mindedly hung them there earlier in the evening and forgotten about it. But as I stood there looking at them, I realized something was off. I hadn't cleaned that classroom that night. In fact, I hadn't even gone near that part of the building. The room itself was one of the older classrooms in the school, the kind that still had chalkboards and wooden desks instead of the newer whiteboards and plastic furniture. It was a room we rarely used except for storage, and I couldn't think of any reason why I would have been in there that night. But somehow, my keys had ended up hanging on that hook, like someone had put them there on purpose. I stood there for a minute, just staring at the keys, trying to make sense of it. Had I gone in there without realizing it? Maybe I'd been so caught up in cleaning that I'd wandered in without thinking and hung up my keys. But that didn't make sense. I had a clear routine, and I always double-checked the rooms I'd cleaned before moving on to the next one. I grabbed the keys and turned to leave, but something stopped me. The room was darker than the others, the overhead lights flickering slightly, and for some reason, I felt this strange urge to check the rest of the room. I don't know why. It's not like I expected to find anything, but I started walking around the desks, looking for, I don't know what. Maybe some sign that someone else had been in there. The room was quiet, just like the rest of the school, and everything was in its place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I finished my rounds as quickly as I could after that, locking up the rest of the rooms and heading back to the janitor's closet to grab my things. By the time I was done, it was close to 11 p.m., and I was more than ready to get out of there. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the whole thing with the keys was probably just me being forgetful, but it still bothered me. The next day, I mentioned it to one of the other janitors, kind of as a joke, but he didn't laugh. He just shrugged and said weird stuff like that happened all the time in the older parts of the school. He told me about times when he'd found doors open that he was sure he'd locked, or lights that were on when they should have been off. He said the building was old, and things like that just happened. I wanted to believe him, but the whole thing with the keys still nagged at me. For the next few weeks, nothing else strange happened, and I almost forgot about it. I fell back into my usual routine, cleaning the classrooms, locking up, and heading home late at night. But every time I walked past that old classroom, I couldn't help but glance at the hook by the door, half expecting to see my keys hanging there again. Then, about a month later, something even weirder happened. It was another late night, and I was almost done with my shift. I had just finished cleaning the gym and was heading back through the hallways to check on a few more classrooms when I noticed that one of the doors was open. It was the same classroom where I'd found my keys before. The door wasn't wide open, just cracked slightly, but I knew for a fact that I had locked it earlier in the night. I always double-checked the doors in that part of the school because they were old and didn't close properly unless you really gave them a good push. I hesitated for a second, debating whether or not to go inside. Part of me wanted to just lock the door and leave it at that, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door fully and stepped inside. Everything looked the same as it had the last time I was in there. The desks were neatly arranged, the chalkboard was clean, and the lights were still flickering slightly, just like before. But this time, something was different. Sitting on the teacher's desk at the front of the room was one of the trash bags I had used earlier in the night. I stared at it for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I had emptied that trash bag in a completely different part of the school. There was no way it should have been in that classroom. But there it was, sitting neatly on the desk, like someone had put it there on purpose. I didn't know what to do. I felt this overwhelming sense of unease, like someone was playing a prank on me, but I couldn't figure out who or how. The school was locked, and as far as I knew, I was the only one still there. I grabbed the bag, threw it back in my cart, and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop to check the rest of the rooms, didn't even finish cleaning up. I just grabbed my things and left, locking the doors behind me. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. I didn't want to sound crazy or paranoid. But after that night, I started noticing other little things. Doors that wouldn't stay locked, lights that would flicker for no reason, objects that seemed to move from one place to another without explanation. It was nothing major, just small, subtle things, but it was enough to keep me on edge every time I walked through the halls alone. I quit the job a few months later. It wasn't because of the strange things that had happened. I just found something better, but I was glad to leave that school behind. Even now, I still think about those nights sometimes, wondering if there was someone else in the building with me. Someone who knew my routine and was messing with me just for fun. I'll never know for sure, but the thought still creeps me out. I used to work as a maintenance technician at an old power plant outside of Kansas City. This was about 5 years ago, and I had been with the plant for a couple of years by that point. It was an isolated place, way out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields and trees. You had to drive down a long, winding road just to get there. The plant wasn't anything fancy, just an old, aging facility that kept some of the rural areas powered. My job was mostly fixing machinery, doing routine checks, and making sure everything was running smoothly, especially during the night shifts. The night shifts were brutal. The plant was big, and most nights I'd be the only one there. There were maybe a couple of other guys who worked the day shifts, but at night, it was just me and the hum of the equipment. The control room was at the heart of the plant, and it had this big board with lights and switches for monitoring all the systems. From there, I could keep an eye on everything: generators, turbines, the works. I had a radio to communicate with anyone outside or the day crew, but during the night, the thing barely made a peep. The building itself was a sprawling maze of metal catwalks, long corridors, and huge rooms filled with humming machinery. There were lots of places to get lost or turned around, especially in the dark. The lights in the plant weren't the best, and parts of it always seemed dim or flickering. I'd gotten used to it over time, but some nights it really felt like the whole place was pressing in on me. One night I came in for my usual shift at around 10 p.m. It was supposed to be a quiet one, nothing out of the ordinary. The weather was calm, no storms or anything that would normally cause issues, so I figured it'd be an easy night. I checked the systems, everything looked good, and I settled into the control room with some paperwork. Around midnight, the power suddenly went out across the entire plant. The hum of the machines cut off instantly, plunging the building into complete darkness. The emergency lights flickered on after a few seconds, casting this dim, eerie glow over everything. It wasn't the first time we'd had a power failure, so I didn't panic right away. I figured it was just a tripped breaker or something small that needed resetting. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out of the control room to check the main breaker panel, which was in the basement of the plant. The basement was probably the creepiest part of the whole building. Long, dark hallways lined with old pipes, rusty equipment, and a constant dripping noise from somewhere in the walls. It was always cold down there, even in the middle of summer, and it had this musty, metallic smell that never went away. As I was walking through the plant, I started hearing these faint noises, footsteps, or at least what I thought were footsteps. I stopped for a second and listened, but it was hard to tell where the sound was coming from. The plant was full of weird noises, the clanking of metal, the hum of machines, but this sounded different, like someone walking around in the dark. I figured maybe one of the day guys had stayed late or come back for something, but I hadn't seen anyone else when I got there. I called out a few times just in case someone was down there with me, but no one answered. The sound of my voice echoed through the empty hallways, and the footsteps stopped. I brushed it off and kept moving. When I reached the breaker panel, everything looked fine. None of the breakers had tripped, and there didn't seem to be any obvious issues with the wiring. I was about to head back to the control room to check the main system again when I heard the footsteps behind me, this time much closer. I spun around, shining my flashlight down the hallway, but there was no one there, just the empty, dimly lit corridor stretching out in both directions. I could feel my heart racing a little, but I told myself it was just the usual creaks and groans of the building. These old places make noise, and it's easy to let your imagination run wild when you're by yourself at night. I finished my check of the breakers and headed back up to the main floor. As I was walking back, the footsteps started again, this time matching my pace. Every time I sped up, they did too. I stopped a few times, thinking maybe it was just an echo or my own footsteps bouncing off the walls, but it didn't feel right. It sounded like someone was following me, staying just out of sight. I reached the control room and locked the door behind me, feeling a little rattled but trying to shake it off. I sat down at the control panel and checked the system again, trying to figure out what was causing the outage. Everything seemed normal on the screens, but the power wasn't coming back on. It didn't make any sense. Then I noticed something strange. There were footprints, muddy, wet footprints, leading from the door of the control room to the desk where I was sitting. They hadn't been there when I first walked in. I stood up, looking down at the prints, and followed them with my flashlight. They were fresh, and they looked like they had been made by someone wearing heavy boots, the kind the guys in the plant wore. But the thing is, I hadn't been outside. There was no reason for my boots to be wet or muddy, and as far as I knew, no one else had been in the plant that night. My stomach twisted as I realized that someone, or something, had been in the room with me, and I hadn't even noticed. I checked the cameras on the control panel, but the power outage had knocked out most of the feeds. The only working camera was one at the main entrance, and it showed the front door locked and secure, just like I had left it when I came in. I sat there for a while, staring at the muddy footprints, trying to make sense of what was happening. The sound of footsteps, the power outage, the footprints that didn't belong to me. It all felt too deliberate, like someone was messing with me. But who? The plant was locked up tight, and there was no way someone could have gotten in without me noticing. After a few minutes, I decided to get up and check the rest of the plant one more time. Maybe there was a simple explanation and I was just getting worked up over nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back out into the hallway, following the trail of footprints. The footprints led me back down to the basement, to the same area where I had checked the breaker panel earlier. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard the footsteps again, this time louder and closer. They were coming from one of the side rooms, a small storage area we rarely used. I stood there for a second listening, trying to figure out if I should go in. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct was telling me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know what was going on. I opened the door to the storage room, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was small, with shelves lining the walls filled with old tools and spare parts. There was nothing unusual in there, no one hiding, no sign of anyone else. But as I stepped inside, I noticed something on the floor. More muddy footprints, leading from the door to the back of the room. I followed the prints, my flashlight shaking in my hand. They stopped at the far wall, right in front of a large metal cabinet. I reached out to open it, but before I could, the power in the plant suddenly came back on. The lights flickered to life, and the familiar hum of the machinery filled the air again. I stood there for a moment, staring at the cabinet, my mind racing. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I was too freaked out to check. I backed out of the room and shut the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night in the control room trying to focus on my work, but I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints and the footsteps I had heard. I never found out who or what had been in the plant with me that night, and the security footage never showed anything unusual. The next day, I mentioned it to one of the other guys on the day shift, and he just shrugged it off, saying the plant was old and weird stuff happened sometimes. He joked that the place was probably haunted, but I didn't find it funny. I used to work as a night receptionist at a small hotel in downtown Denver. This was about 4 years ago when I had just moved to the city. The hotel was a 5-story building, pretty old and a bit run down, but it was cheap and close to the city center. My shifts were from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., so I was mostly there when things were quiet, the streets were empty, and all the guests were usually asleep. The nights could be long and boring, but I was okay with it because it gave me time to study, catch up on reading, or just scroll through my phone. The hotel didn't have a large staff. During the day, there were 2 other receptionists who covered the morning and afternoon shifts, a couple of cleaning staff, and a manager who worked 9 to 5. The night was quiet. No cleaners, no maintenance people. It was just me at the front desk with the occasional guest coming in late. One night I was doing my usual rounds, checking the guest list, making sure all the rooms were accounted for. The place had about 50 rooms, but on a weekday night, maybe 20 would be occupied at best. The hotel catered mostly to business travelers or people passing through. It wasn't the kind of place you'd book for a vacation. Around 2 a.m., I was scrolling through my phone trying to keep myself awake when I heard a noise. It was this loud, distinct knock that echoed through the lobby. It came from one of the guest room floors. I looked up, confused because it wasn't coming from the lobby, but somewhere further inside the building. I brushed it off at first, figuring it was just a guest, maybe someone who had locked themselves out of their room or needed assistance. But it happened again. This time it was louder, more persistent, and it seemed to be coming from one of the upper floors. I grabbed the guest list and started scanning through it, trying to figure out which room might be causing the noise. There was one room that stood out, room 314. It had been vacant for weeks. The last guest to stay in there had checked out about a month ago, and the room had been locked ever since. No one had been assigned to that room since then, and I hadn't given out any keys for it. I felt a bit uneasy. Maybe I had just misheard where the knocking was coming from. It could have been any room after all. I decided to ignore it for the time being, but then, a few minutes later, the knocking started again. Same room, room 314. At this point, I was starting to feel a little on edge. I hadn't given out a key for that room in a long time, so how could anyone be in there? I tried to think of a reasonable explanation. Maybe one of the cleaning staff had left something inside and had come back after hours. But then again, the cleaning staff never worked at night, and I hadn't seen anyone enter the building besides guests that night. I decided to check the security cameras. We had them covering the hallways on each floor, as well as the lobby and the main entrance. I pulled up the feed for the 3rd floor and scanned through the footage. The hallway outside room 314 was empty. No one had entered or exited the room in hours. I checked the other floors too, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The knocking continued, growing louder and more frequent. At this point, I knew I had to check it out. Maybe it was a plumbing issue or some other maintenance problem, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the master key from the desk, took a deep breath, and headed up to the 3rd floor. The hallways were dimly lit with that sort of yellowish light that made everything feel a bit claustrophobic. The air was stale, and it had that old hotel smell, a mix of cleaning chemicals and dust. As I made my way down the hall, the knocking stopped. I paused for a moment outside the door to room 314, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I didn't hear anything now. The hallway was silent. I took out the master key, inserted it into the lock, and slowly opened the door. The room was dark. I reached for the light switch just inside the door and flicked it on. The room lit up, revealing the standard setup: a double bed, a small table with a lamp, a dresser, and a bathroom to the side. Everything looked perfectly normal, untouched. The bed was made, the room was clean, and nothing seemed out of place. I stepped inside and looked around. No signs of anyone. I checked the bathroom, the closet, nothing. The window was closed, and there was no way anyone could have entered or exited the room without being seen. I stood there for a moment, feeling a bit stupid. Maybe I had just imagined the whole thing. The knocking could have been coming from another room, or maybe the pipes were making noise. I didn't want to overthink it. I locked the door behind me and headed back down to the lobby, trying to shake off the weird feeling I had. I didn't hear the knocking again for the rest of the night. A couple of nights went by without any incidents. I started to forget about the whole thing, convincing myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, it happened again. Same time, around 2 a.m., the loud knocking coming from room 314. This time I was ready. I immediately checked the cameras again. Same thing. The hallway was completely empty. No one had gone in or out. I wasn't as eager to go up there this time, but I knew I had to check it out again. I grabbed the master key and headed back up to the 3rd floor. When I got to room 314, I hesitated before unlocking the door. The hallway was quiet, just like last time, and I didn't hear the knocking anymore. I opened the door, flicked on the light, and once again, everything was exactly as it should be. The room was completely normal, but this time, something caught my eye. On the bed, there was a slight indentation, like someone had been sitting there recently. I hadn't noticed it the first time, but now it was obvious. The bed was made, but there was a clear mark in the middle where the comforter was pushed down, like someone had sat or even laid down on it. I felt a chill run down my spine. I checked the room thoroughly again, even going so far as to check under the bed and behind the curtains, but there was no one there. The window was locked, and there was no way anyone could have gotten in or out without me seeing them on the cameras. I locked the door and went back to the lobby, but the uneasiness stayed with me for the rest of the night. I didn't tell anyone about it. It felt too strange, and I didn't want to come across as paranoid or crazy. Over the next few weeks, the knocking became a regular occurrence. It didn't happen every night, but it was often enough that I started to dread going up to the 3rd floor. I tried to ignore it at first, but it was hard to concentrate on anything else when I knew it was happening. The sound was so distinct, so deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. One night, I decided to leave the security camera feed for the 3rd floor running on my monitor so I could keep an eye on it without having to go up there. I watched the hallway outside room 314 closely, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Around 2:15 a.m., the knocking started again. I stared at the monitor, but the hallway was empty. There was no one there. That was the night I decided to stop going up to check. I couldn't handle the thought of going back into that room again, especially when I knew no one was supposed to be in there. The knocking wasn't my problem anymore. As long as it wasn't disturbing the guests, I didn't care. I never figured out what was causing it. The room stayed vacant, and eventually the knocking just stopped altogether. I never mentioned it to my manager or anyone else who worked at the hotel. It felt too weird to explain, and I figured no one would believe me anyway. I ended up leaving that job a few months later to move on to something else, and I never looked back. I used to be a late-night delivery driver in rural Virginia, covering a lot of ground between small towns. I worked for a company that handled all sorts of deliveries, everything from groceries to medical supplies to furniture. Most of my routes took me through long stretches of empty roads and old bridges, where it felt like I was the only person for miles. The pay was decent, and I didn't mind the solitude. I actually liked driving at night, when there were fewer cars on the road, and the world felt quiet. One of my regular routes took me over an old bridge outside of Fredericksburg. The bridge wasn't particularly long, but it was old and creaky, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. It crossed over a shallow river, and the surrounding area was mostly woods, with no houses or buildings in sight. I had crossed it countless times, both during the day and night, and I never thought much of it. It was just part of the job. One night I had a late delivery, a rush order for some medical supplies that needed to be dropped off at a clinic on the other side of town. It was around 2 a.m. and I was making my way down the familiar back roads. The sky was dark, no moon, just clouds and a light drizzle of rain. I had the radio on low, trying to keep myself awake as I drove through the empty, winding roads. As I approached the bridge, I noticed something that made me slow down. There was a figure standing near the edge of the bridge, right where the railing met the water. At first, I thought it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me, but as I got closer, I realized it was definitely a person. It was a woman standing completely still, her back to me, staring down at the water below. I hit the brakes and slowed to a crawl as I crossed the bridge, unsure of what to do. My first thought was that she might be in some kind of trouble, maybe a stranded driver or someone who needed help. But as I got closer, something about the way she was standing felt off. She didn't turn to look at me, didn't move at all. She was just standing there, motionless in the rain, with her hands resting on the railing. I rolled down my window a little, thinking I should at least call out to her, see if she was okay. But the moment I did, a wave of uncertainty hit me. What if she wasn't okay? What if she was in some kind of distress? Or worse, what if she was waiting for someone or something? The rain was picking up, and the sound of it hitting the roof of my van drowned out any thoughts I was trying to collect. I kept driving, passing her slowly. I craned my neck to get a better look, but her face was turned away from me, hidden by a hood or long hair. She didn't even acknowledge my van creeping past, didn't react at all, just stood there staring at the water. I crossed the bridge and drove a little further down the road before pulling over. I wasn't sure if I should turn around or keep going. Something in my gut told me not to go back, that I should just finish the delivery and leave it at that. But another part of me felt like I couldn't just leave her there. What if something was really wrong? I grabbed my phone and called the local non-emergency line, explaining that I had seen someone standing on the bridge and wasn't sure if they needed help. The dispatcher said they'd send someone to check it out and thanked me for calling. That should have been the end of it. I should have felt relieved that someone else would handle it. But as I sat there in the van, engine idling, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. After a minute, I decided to turn around. I told myself I'd just drive by one more time, make sure everything was okay, and if the cops showed up, I'd explain that I was the one who called. I turned the van around and headed back toward the bridge, trying to mentally prepare myself for whatever I might see. As I approached the bridge again, I slowed down and scanned the area, but the woman was gone. There was no sign of her anywhere, no figure on the bridge, no one standing near the railing. The road was empty, the rain still coming down in light drizzles. I drove slowly across the bridge, glancing to both sides, but she had completely disappeared. I stopped the van in the middle of the bridge, my headlights cutting through the rain. I looked out toward the water, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sound except the rain hitting the surface of the river below. I thought maybe she had walked off or moved further down the road, but it didn't make sense. I hadn't been gone long enough for her to just vanish like that. I sat there for a few more minutes, waiting for the police to show up, but no one came. The road was completely deserted. After a while, I convinced myself that maybe she had just left. Maybe she had been a passerby or someone out for a walk, though walking across a rural bridge in the middle of the night during a rainstorm didn't seem like something anyone would do. I finally gave up and drove off, telling myself that the cops would take care of it if there was anything to worry about. I finished my delivery and went home, but the image of that woman standing on the bridge stuck with me. A few nights later, I had another delivery that took me down the same route. It was around the same time, just after 1 a.m., and as I approached the bridge, my stomach tightened. I told myself it was just nerves, that nothing weird would happen this time, but I couldn't shake the memory of seeing that woman standing there. I crossed the bridge without incident, no one in sight, no figures standing by the railing. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding and kept driving. But when I reached the other side of the bridge and glanced in my rearview mirror, I saw her again. She was standing in the exact same spot, right where I had seen her the first time, facing the water, her back to me. I slammed on the brakes and whipped my head around to look, but when I turned to look out the back window, she was gone. Just like before. I sat there, staring at the bridge in my rearview mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I hadn't imagined it. She had been there, clear as day. But now, just like the last time, she had disappeared the moment I looked away. I didn't turn back this time. I kept driving, not stopping until I was miles away from the bridge. I made the delivery, but my mind was racing the entire time. I couldn't stop thinking about that woman, about how she had just vanished like that, twice. For weeks after that, I avoided that route. I found alternate ways to make my deliveries, even if it meant going out of my way or taking longer to get there. I didn't want to cross that bridge again. I didn't want to see her standing there. Eventually, I asked a few of the other drivers if they had seen anything strange on that bridge. Most of them said no, but one of the older guys, Rick, gave me a strange look when I brought it up. He asked me if I had seen the woman on the bridge. When I told him what I had seen, he just nodded and said that a few of them have seen her. She shows up every now and then, always late at night and always standing by the railing. I asked him if he knew who she was or why she was there, but he didn't have an answer. He said there had been stories about that bridge for years, rumors about accidents and drownings, but nothing concrete. No one knew for sure who she was or why she appeared. She was just there. About 4 years ago, I worked as a security guard at a high-end apartment complex in downtown Seattle. It wasn't a bad job. The building was new, had 15 floors, and catered to the kind of people who didn't really want to interact with the security staff. My main responsibility was monitoring the surveillance cameras, doing occasional patrols of the building, and responding to any resident complaints. Most nights it was quiet and uneventful. I'd sit in the small security office, watch the screens, and kill time by scrolling through my phone or reading a book. The security office was tucked away in the lobby near the entrance. We had a whole wall of monitors, each connected to different cameras placed around the building: hallways, stairwells, elevators, the lobby, and the parking garage. You'd be surprised how much you can see from those cameras. People forget they're there, so you catch them in moments they wouldn't want others to see, but it's usually harmless stuff. One night, it was particularly slow. It was around 2 a.m., and I was the only one on shift. I had just finished my rounds, walking through the lobby and around the exterior of the building to make sure everything was in order. I settled back into the security office and started watching the cameras again, expecting another quiet night. Then something caught my eye. One of the cameras on the 15th floor, the top floor, had picked up movement. It was the hallway camera, pointed straight down the corridor toward the row of apartment doors. At first, I didn't think much of it. People came and went at all hours, and it wasn't unusual to see someone coming home late. But this was different. There was a figure standing at the far end of the hallway, near one of the windows that looked out over the city. They weren't moving, just standing completely still, facing the window. I couldn't make out much detail from the camera's angle, just the silhouette of someone standing there, their face turned toward the glass. I watched for a few seconds, waiting for them to move, but they didn't. It was strange. Most people either went straight to their apartment or walked past the camera on their way to the elevator, but this person wasn't doing either. I zoomed in on the feed, trying to get a better look, but the quality wasn't great. All I could see was the back of their head and shoulders. I decided to check the other cameras on the 15th floor to see if I could get a different angle. There was a camera at the elevator bank and another one by the stairwell, but neither showed anyone coming or going. It was like they had just appeared there, in the hallway, without taking the elevator or stairs. I switched back to the hallway camera, and the figure was still there, standing in the same spot, completely motionless. At this point, I was starting to feel uneasy. I couldn't figure out why anyone would be standing there in the middle of the night, doing nothing. I grabbed my radio and called up to the 15th floor to see if there was an issue or if someone needed assistance, but no one responded. I waited a few more minutes, watching the figure on the screen, hoping they'd just leave or go into one of the apartments, but they didn't. They just kept standing there facing the window. After a while, I decided to go up and check it out myself. It wasn't uncommon for me to handle noise complaints or disturbances, so I figured it was probably just a resident who was drunk or confused. I grabbed my flashlight and took the elevator up to the 15th floor, feeling a little on edge as the numbers ticked up. When the elevator doors opened, the hallway was completely empty. The figure was gone. I stepped out of the elevator and looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. The hallway was silent, the lights flickering slightly as they always did. I walked down to the end of the hall where the figure had been standing, but there was nothing there, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I checked the apartment doors nearby, but they were all locked and undisturbed. I figured maybe they had gone into one of the apartments while I was on my way up. It didn't make sense that they could have disappeared so quickly, but I didn't have any other explanation. I walked back to the elevator and returned to the security office, trying to shake off the weird feeling that had settled in my stomach. When I got back to the office, I checked the camera footage again, rewinding it to the moment I had seen the figure. Sure enough, there they were, standing at the end of the hallway, motionless. I fast-forwarded the footage to the moment I had left to check on them, expecting to see them leave or walk into one of the apartments. But they didn't. The figure just vanished. One second they were there, standing by the window, and the next second they were gone. No movement, no footsteps, no opening doors. They just disappeared. I replayed the footage over and over, trying to find some explanation, but there was nothing. It was like they had just blinked out of existence. I spent the rest of the night on edge, watching the cameras closely, but nothing else happened. The figure didn't reappear, and the 15th floor stayed quiet. I finished my shift and went home, trying to convince myself that it was just a glitch or a trick of the cameras, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. A few nights later, it happened again. I was back on the night shift watching the cameras as usual when I saw movement on the 15th floor camera. This time it was around 3 a.m., and there was another figure standing in the same spot as before, near the window at the end of the hallway. At first I thought it might be the same person, but this figure was different, taller, with a heavier build. They were standing in the exact same position though, facing the window, completely still. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like a replay of the first incident, but with a different person. I zoomed in on the camera again, but just like before, I couldn't make out any details. The figure was standing too far away, and the lighting in the hallway wasn't great. I watched them for a few minutes, waiting to see if they'd move or do something, but they just stood there. I checked the other cameras on the 15th floor, but once again, there was no sign of anyone coming or going. It was like they had just appeared there, out of nowhere. This time I didn't go up to check. I wasn't sure what I would find, and to be honest, I didn't want to see the empty hallway again. I watched the camera feed for a while longer, waiting for the figure to leave. But just like before, they vanished without a trace. One second they were there, and the next second, they were gone. After that night, I started dreading my shifts. I kept expecting to see another figure on the 15th floor, standing by that same window, but it didn't happen again, at least not while I was on duty. I heard rumors from some of the other security guards that strange things had happened in the building before, but no one had ever mentioned anything like this. I used to work as a train conductor on a night route that ran through the rural areas of upstate New York. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills. The route itself was long, stretching through miles of farmland, forests, and small towns before finally reaching the city. Most of my shift was spent in the dark, with nothing but the headlights of the train cutting through the blackness. It could get lonely out there, especially when the nights were quiet and there wasn't much radio chatter to break up the monotony. I got used to the routine though, and most nights were pretty uneventful. There was this one part of the route that always made me a little uneasy though. It was a long tunnel that cut through a small mountain. The tunnel was old, one of those things built over a century ago that never seemed to have gotten any major updates. The walls were covered in soot and grime, and the whole thing always felt a little too tight, even though the train fit through it just fine. It was about a mile long, maybe a little more, and passing through it at night felt like plunging into a black hole. The headlights barely illuminated more than a few feet ahead, and the darkness seemed to swallow up the train. I'd been running that route for a while before anything strange happened. The first time I noticed something was off was during a particularly quiet night. It was one of those nights where there wasn't much to do but keep an eye on the tracks and wait for the next checkpoint. We were about halfway through the route, and I knew the tunnel was coming up in a few miles. As we entered the tunnel, the familiar feeling of unease crept over me. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just that nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. The air felt heavier in there, the train seemed to hum a little louder, and the darkness outside the windows was absolute. You couldn't see anything except the reflection of the interior lights in the glass. About halfway through the tunnel, I heard something unusual, a faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on the side of the train. It wasn't loud, more like a gentle but steady tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it was just something rattling in the engine, maybe a loose panel or a tool that had shifted, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I listened closely, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it seemed to be coming from all around me. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, just persistent enough to be noticeable. I looked out the window, but of course I couldn't see anything, just the pitch-black walls of the tunnel. The tapping stopped just as we exited the tunnel, and everything went back to normal. I didn't think much of it at the time, chalking it up to the weird acoustics in the tunnel or something. But the next night, it happened again. Same spot, same tapping. This time it lasted a little longer, and I was sure it was coming from outside the train. It almost sounded like someone was running their fingers along the side of the car, keeping pace with the train as we moved through the tunnel. I tried to ignore it, but the sound was so out of place in the otherwise quiet ride that it was impossible to completely shake off. After a few nights of this, I started to feel uneasy every time we approached the tunnel. The tapping became a regular occurrence, always starting in the middle of the tunnel, always stopping the moment we emerged back into the open. I checked the train for loose panels or anything that could be causing the noise, but everything seemed fine. The other crew members didn't seem to notice it, or if they did, they didn't mention it. One night, the tapping started again, just like usual, but this time I thought I saw something, a brief flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. It was quick, just a blur in the darkness, but enough to catch my attention. I turned to look, but there was nothing there, just the black walls of the tunnel rushing past the window. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that the shadows were playing tricks on me. But after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something, or someone out there, just beyond the train, moving in the darkness. The next few nights, I kept my eyes glued to the window every time we passed through the tunnel, waiting to catch another glimpse of whatever it was. I didn't see anything for a while, but the tapping continued, as steady and rhythmic as ever. Then, one night, it escalated. We were about halfway through the tunnel when the tapping started again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. It sounded like someone was banging on the side of the train with their fist. I could feel the vibrations through the floor, and the sound echoed through the car. I stood up from my seat, trying to get a better look out the window, but all I could see was the blur of the tunnel walls. The tapping grew louder, almost frantic, and for a moment I was sure I saw a hand, just the outline of a hand, pale and thin, pressing against the window. It was there for a split second, and then it was gone. I jumped back, my heart racing. I looked around the car, half expecting to see someone standing there, but it was empty. Just me and the train, barreling through the tunnel. The tapping stopped abruptly as we exited the tunnel, and everything went quiet again. I sat back down, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Had it really been a hand? Or was it just my imagination, fueled by the weird acoustics and the darkness? I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't want to sound crazy, and I wasn't even sure what I had seen. But from that night on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time we approached the tunnel, my anxiety spiked, and I found myself dreading the moment we would enter the darkness again. The tapping continued, always the same, always stopping when we left the tunnel, but I never saw the hand again. Not clearly, anyway. There were moments when I thought I saw movement, or a flash of something in the corner of my eye, but it was never enough to be sure. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. The constant tapping, the unease, the feeling that there was something or someone out there just beyond the train was too much. I asked to be reassigned to a different route, one that didn't go through the tunnel. I never told my supervisors why. I just said I needed a change of pace, that the night shifts were getting to me. They didn't ask any questions, and I was transferred to a new route a few weeks later. I haven't been through that tunnel since, but I still think about it sometimes. I wonder if the tapping ever stopped, or if the new conductor on that route is hearing it now. I wonder if they've seen the hand pressed against the window, or if it was just me. A couple of years ago, I was working as an overnight cleaner at a community center in San Antonio. The place wasn't huge, but it was big enough that it took me a full shift to get everything done. The building had a gym, a few meeting rooms, offices, and a rec room for kids. It was one of those places that stayed pretty busy during the day with after-school programs, fitness classes, and all sorts of community events. But by the time my shift started at 11 p.m., the place was usually empty. The community center had been around for decades, and you could tell. Some parts of the building had been renovated, but others were still stuck in the past. Creaky floors, outdated fixtures, and those old fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. It wasn't uncommon for things to break down or stop working altogether. The basement in particular always felt like an afterthought, like they hadn't bothered to update it since the place was built. It was mostly used for storage, and the staff told me I didn't need to go down there unless there was a specific reason. "Don't bother with the basement unless you have to," was what my boss told me when I first started. I didn't think much of it at the time. Most buildings like this had weird, out-of-the-way areas no one really cared about. So for the first few months, I stayed out of the basement and focused on the rest of the building. One night, though, something came up. It was a slow night, and I had just finished cleaning the gym when I noticed the light in the stairwell to the basement was on. I didn't remember turning it on, and no one else had been in the building, so it was strange. I figured maybe it had been left on by accident during the day. No big deal. I made my way over, intending to turn it off and head back to the main cleaning. But as I approached the door to the basement, I noticed something else. The door wasn't closed all the way. It was slightly ajar, just enough that the light from the stairwell was spilling out into the hallway. I didn't like that. That door was supposed to be kept locked, and I was the only one in the building with the keys during my shift. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether I should check it out or just lock the door and move on. After a few seconds, I decided to investigate. I grabbed the key ring off my belt, turned on my flashlight, and pushed the door open. The stairwell was steep and narrow, the concrete walls damp with condensation. I had only been down there a couple of times before, and every time I did, it felt like I was stepping into a different building. The temperature dropped noticeably as soon as I entered the stairwell, and the air had that musty, stale smell you get in places that don't get much airflow. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs, my flashlight sweeping over the cracked walls and chipped paint. The light overhead flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. The basement itself was a labyrinth of rooms and corridors, most of them filled with old furniture, broken equipment, and things the community center staff had no use for anymore. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I wanted to make sure everything was in order before locking up. The further I went, the more I regretted coming down. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the noise of my footsteps echoed off the concrete floor, making the space feel even more claustrophobic. I walked through a few of the storage rooms, checking to see if anything was out of place, but everything seemed normal. That's when I heard it. A faint sound like a door closing. It came from deeper in the basement, down one of the long, narrow corridors that branched off from the main area. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the basement, it was unmistakable. I froze, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I was the only one in the building, so the idea that someone else could be down there with me didn't make any sense. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to follow the sound or head back upstairs and forget the whole thing. But curiosity got the better of me, and I started walking toward the source of the noise, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I moved down the corridor, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in even tighter. There were no windows down here, no natural light, just the flickering fluorescence and the beam from my flashlight. I rounded a corner and found myself in front of a door I hadn't noticed before. It was old, made of heavy wood, with rusted hinges and a tarnished brass handle. It looked out of place compared to the rest of the basement, like it had been there long before the community center was built. I reached out and tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked and there was no sign of any other way in. I stood there for a moment, listening, trying to figure out where the sound had come from. But the basement was silent again. The only noise the faint hum of the lights overhead. I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I didn't like it. I turned around and headed back toward the stairwell, picking up my pace as I went. The sense of unease that had been nagging at me all night was now a full-on feeling of dread, and I wanted to be out of that basement as quickly as possible. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard the noise again. It was the same sound, like a door closing, but this time, it was right behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight down the corridor, but there was no one there. The door at the end of the hallway, the one that had been locked, was now slightly open, just like the basement door had been when I first came down. My stomach dropped. There was no way that door had opened on its own. It had been locked, and I hadn't seen anyone else down there. I stood there, frozen, staring at the door, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then, slowly, the door started to close again. Not fast, not like it had been pushed, but as if it was being pulled shut from the other side. I bolted. I didn't wait to see what was behind that door, didn't care to find out. I ran up the stairs 2 at a time, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I slammed the door to the basement shut behind me and locked it, leaning against the wall as I tried to calm down. I stood there for what felt like forever, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. I didn't know what I had just seen, didn't know what could have opened that door, or why it had closed on its own. All I knew was that I wasn't going back down there. I finished the rest of my shift in a daze, barely able to focus on my work. I avoided the stairwell to the basement, sticking to the main floors of the building, and when my shift finally ended, I left as quickly as I could. I never mentioned what happened to anyone. I didn't think they'd believe me, and I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. But after that night, I made sure to avoid the basement as much as possible. I'd lock the door and make a point of not going down there unless I absolutely had to. A few years ago, I was working the night shift as a 911 operator in Phoenix, Arizona. The job wasn't exactly glamorous, but it was steady work, and I was pretty good at it. Most of the calls I handled were routine: car accidents, noise complaints, the occasional domestic disturbance. You'd think working nights would mean fewer calls, but it's actually when things get weird. People get drunk, do stupid things, or worse, they're desperate for help in the middle of the night when no one else is around. I'd been doing the job long enough to develop a bit of a routine. The night shift was quieter, but not by much. I'd spend hours listening to people who were panicking, crying or screaming, trying to calm them down and send the right help their way. You get used to it, as messed up as that sounds. It becomes second nature to stay calm no matter what you hear on the other end of the line. One night, though, I got a call that still bothers me to this day. It was different from anything I'd dealt with before, and it stuck with me ever since. It was around 2:30 a.m., mid-shift, and things had been pretty slow that night. I was scrolling through some paperwork when the phone rang. I answered like usual with my script. No one answered. At first I thought it was a prank or maybe a misdial, which happens more often than you'd think, but then I heard something. A faint, labored breathing on the other end of the line. It wasn't the normal heavy breathing you sometimes get from people who are panicking or hyperventilating. This was different. It sounded almost deliberate, like someone was taking slow, deep breaths right into the phone. I spoke again, asking if anyone was there, if they needed help, but there was still no response. Just more breathing. It was unsettling to say the least, but I kept my tone calm and professional, thinking maybe it was someone who couldn't speak. Maybe an intruder was nearby, and they were too scared to talk. We're trained to handle situations like that, so I tried to keep the conversation going, hoping the person would give me something to go on. Still, nothing but breathing. I stayed on the line, waiting, and after a while, I heard a faint noise in the background. It was distant but unmistakable, like the creaking of floorboards or the soft thud of footsteps. Someone was moving around wherever this person was calling from. I asked again if they needed help, trying to get them to give me some clue, but there was no verbal response. The breathing got a little heavier, and I could hear the sound of movement growing closer, like whoever it was walking toward the phone. Then, suddenly the line went dead. I sat there for a minute, staring at the monitor, waiting to see if the call would come back through, but it didn't. It wasn't uncommon for people to hang up in the middle of a call, especially if they were scared or didn't want to be tracked, but something about this felt wrong. The breathing, the footsteps. It just didn't sit right with me. I pulled up the call logs to check the number and location. The number had come up as unknown, which wasn't unusual. Lots of people use blocked numbers or burner phones, but the location was what threw me. The call had come from an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city, in a neighborhood that had been mostly torn down years ago. I'd heard about the area before. It was one of those places that had been hit hard by the housing crisis and left to rot. Most of the homes were boarded up or partially demolished, and no one lived there anymore, at least not legally. Occasionally, the police would get calls about squatters or kids messing around in the area, but it was pretty much a dead zone. I couldn't imagine why someone would be calling from there, especially in the middle of the night. I flagged the call as suspicious and sent it over to the police dispatch explaining the situation. They said they'd send a car out to check the area, but there wasn't much urgency. I mean, it was an old abandoned house and the call had already disconnected. There wasn't much they could do at that point. I tried to put it out of my mind and went back to work, but about an hour later, the same number called again. I answered right away, but it was the same as before. No response, just the same slow, heavy breathing. This time, though, there was no sound of movement, just the breathing, steady and deliberate, like someone was sitting right next to the phone. I asked again if they needed help, but there was no reply. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Something about the call just felt wrong, like whoever was on the other end knew I was there but didn't want to say anything. They just wanted me to listen. The call lasted about 2 minutes before the line went dead again. I immediately pulled up the location, and sure enough, it was the same abandoned house. I called the police dispatch and told them about the second call. urging them to send someone out there as soon as possible. This time, they seemed a little more concerned and said they'd get someone there right away. I sat there for the next half hour watching the clock, waiting for an update from the police. Finally, one of the officers called back. He said they'd checked the house, but there was no sign of anyone. The place was boarded up, just like all the other houses in the area, and there were no lights, no vehicles, nothing to indicate anyone had been there recently. They'd done a quick sweep inside, but it was completely empty. Just a bunch of old, broken-down furniture and debris. I didn't know what to think. The calls had come from that location, but there was no sign of anyone there. The officer said they'd keep an eye on the area, but there wasn't much else they could do. The next few nights were quiet. I didn't get any more calls from that number and things went back to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept thinking about those calls, the breathing, the footsteps. It just didn't add up. Then, a week later, the number called again. This time, I felt a pit in my stomach as soon as I saw the unknown number pop up on my screen. I answered, and just like before, there was no response. Just the same slow, heavy breathing. But this time, there was something different. In the background, I could hear what sounded like faint whispering, barely audible over the sound of the breathing. It was hard to make out, but it sounded like multiple voices whispering in unison. It was almost like a chant, though I couldn't understand the words. I tried to get the caller to say something, anything, but they didn't respond. They just kept breathing, and the whispering grew louder. I flagged the call for the police again, but before I could finish, the line went dead. I didn't wait this time. I called the police dispatch myself and told them about the call. They were already familiar with the situation and sent a unit to the house immediately. This time, when the police arrived, they found something. They didn't tell me what it was right away, but later I heard through a contact at dispatch that the house had been broken into. They found signs that someone had been inside recently, footprints in the dust, a broken window in the back, but no one was there when they arrived. The strange part was that there were no signs of squatters, no food or sleeping bags, nothing to indicate someone had been living there. Just a single old rotary phone sitting on the floor in the middle of the room. It wasn't even plugged in. The police didn't have any explanation. They said it could have been some kind of prank or someone messing around, but they couldn't figure out how the calls had been coming from a disconnected phone in an abandoned house. I never got another call from that number after that, but it still haunts me. I've worked hundreds of shifts since then, taken countless calls, but nothing has ever come close to the eerie feeling I got from those calls. I used to work the night shift at a gas station just outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico. It wasn't a bad job, and most of the time it was quiet. The station was small, just off the highway, and we didn't get much traffic after midnight except for the occasional trucker or someone passing through on a road trip. Most nights I'd spend my time wiping down counters, stocking the shelves, or scrolling through my phone to pass the time. There was something strangely peaceful about working those hours. The world felt slower, quieter, like I was disconnected from the chaos of the day. It was the kind of job where you could go hours without seeing anyone, and while that might sound boring, I didn't mind it. That's why I stayed there for as long as I did. But there was one night, toward the end of my time working there, that changed everything. It was a Thursday and the shift started like any other. I clocked in around 10 p.m., took over from the day shift guy, and settled in behind the counter. The station was clean, the shelves were stocked, and I figured it'd be another uneventful night. The only thing out of the ordinary was the weather. It was one of those hot, dry nights where the air felt heavy, even after the sun had gone down. Around 1 a.m., a car pulled into the lot. It wasn't unusual to get a late-night customer, especially on a weeknight when people were heading home from work or coming back from somewhere out of town. The car parked near the entrance facing the store, but no one got out. At first, I thought maybe they were just finishing a phone call or something, but after a few minutes, it started to feel strange. The headlights were still on, and the car was just sitting there, engine running, but no one was moving. I couldn't see much because of the glare from the headlights, but I could make out the shape of a figure sitting in the driver's seat. They weren't moving at all, just sitting there, staring straight ahead. I waited for another couple of minutes, thinking maybe they were just tired or needed a moment before coming in. But the longer the car sat there, the more I felt like something was off. Eventually, I stepped outside to see if they needed help. As soon as I opened the door, the heat hit me like a wall, and the headlights seemed even brighter up close. I shielded my eyes with my hand and walked toward the car, trying to get a better look at the driver. As I got closer, I could make out more details. The car was an older model, probably from the late 90s, and it looked a little run down. Dusty windows, a few dents on the side. The driver was a man, maybe in his 40s or 50s, with thinning hair and a worn-out jacket. He was just sitting there, staring straight ahead, not looking at me, not acknowledging that I was even there. I knocked on the window lightly, trying not to startle him, but there was no response. He didn't turn his head, didn't move at all. I knocked again, a little louder this time, and called out to him, asking if he was okay. Still nothing. He just kept staring forward, hands on the steering wheel, completely still. By this point, I was starting to feel uneasy. There was something about the way he was sitting there, so unnaturally still, that didn't feel right. I thought maybe he had fallen asleep or passed out, but his eyes were open, and his hands were gripping the wheel tightly, like he was frozen in place. I backed away from the car, not sure what to do. I thought about calling the police or maybe an ambulance, but I didn't want to overreact. People come into the station in all kinds of states, and most of the time it's nothing serious. But something about this guy, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back inside the station, hoping that maybe he'd snap out of it and come in, or at least drive off. I kept an eye on him through the window, but he didn't move. He just sat there, headlights on, staring straight ahead. After a few more minutes, I decided to check the security cameras. We had a few set up around the parking lot and the inside of the store, mostly as a precaution against theft. I pulled up the footage on the monitor behind the counter and rewound to when the car had first pulled in. That's when things got even weirder. The car had pulled into the lot around 12:55 a.m., a full 10 minutes before I had noticed it. It rolled in slowly, coming to a stop in the exact same spot where it was still parked. But when I looked closer, I realized something strange. The driver never moved. From the moment the car stopped, he hadn't shifted in his seat, hadn't turned his head, hadn't done anything. It was like he had frozen the second the car came to a stop. I fast-forwarded the footage, watching as the minutes ticked by. The car just sat there, the driver still as a statue, while the clock on the monitor rolled forward. It was unsettling to watch. Normally people fidget, adjust their seat, or at least check their phone when they're sitting in a car, but this guy hadn't moved an inch. I switched to a different camera angle, hoping to get a better view of his face. But the glare from the headlights made it impossible to see anything clearly. All I could make out was his silhouette, sitting there in the same rigid position, hands on the wheel, eyes forward. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I knew I didn't want to go back outside to check again. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the car through the window, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the car just kept idling, the headlights cutting through the darkness, the driver frozen in place. Finally, around 2:30 a.m., the car's engine cut off, the headlights dimmed, and for the first time in over an hour, there was movement. The driver's door opened slowly and the man stepped out. He moved like he was stiff, like his joints hadn't moved in hours. He stood next to the car for a moment, just staring at the gas station, before slowly walking toward the entrance. I felt a surge of panic. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I suddenly didn't want him to come inside. There was something about the way he was moving, the way he had just sat there for so long, that made me want to lock the doors and pretend I wasn't there. But I couldn't do that, so I stayed behind the counter, watching as he made his way across the parking lot and into the station. When he walked in, the air inside the station seemed to get colder. He didn't look around, didn't browse the shelves like most customers. He just walked straight up to the counter, his eyes fixed on me the whole time. Up close, he looked worse than I had expected. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were sunken, with dark circles underneath. His clothes were rumpled, like he'd been wearing them for days, and there was a faint smell of something stale and sour coming off him. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me with this blank expression. I tried to ask him if he needed help, but my voice came out shaky and he didn't respond. He just stood there looking at me with those dull, lifeless eyes. After a few moments of silence, he finally spoke, but his voice was low and raspy, like he hadn't used it in a long time. He asked me if I had seen a car. At first, I didn't understand what he meant. He was standing right in front of me, his car still parked outside. But then he asked again, more urgently this time, if I had seen a car. I told him I hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary, just his car when it pulled in. He stared at me for a moment longer, then, without another word, he turned and walked back outside. I watched him as he got back into his car, started the engine, and slowly drove off into the night. I stood there behind the counter, watching the taillights disappear down the highway, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I don't know what he was talking about, what car he was looking for, or why he had been sitting there for so long. But whatever it was, I'm glad he's gone. I used to work the night shift at this small 24-hour diner just off the highway outside of Fort Worth, Texas. It wasn't much, just a little greasy spoon where truckers and late-night travelers would stop for a quick bite. The place had been around for decades, and it looked it. Worn-out linoleum floors, chipped Formica tables, and an old neon sign that buzzed softly outside. It wasn't fancy, but it was a decent job, and I liked the quiet most nights. The diner was set up pretty simply. There was the main dining area with about a dozen tables, a counter with stools facing the grill, and a small kitchen in the back where the cook would work. When it was slow, like it usually was at night, it'd just be me running the front and one cook in the back. We'd keep the place open, but most nights we'd get maybe 3 or 4 customers after midnight, if that. Sometimes I'd go an hour or 2 without seeing anyone at all. One night it was raining hard. The kind of Texas storm where the rain just comes down in sheets and the sky's lit up with lightning every few minutes. It was around 2 a.m. and I'd been by myself for the past hour. No customers, no deliveries, just the sound of rain pounding on the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder. The cook, Dave, had stepped out for a smoke a while ago and hadn't come back yet, but that wasn't unusual. He liked to take long breaks during his shifts, especially when it was slow. I was wiping down the counter when I noticed something strange. There were wet, muddy footprints leading from the front door to the back of the diner. At first I didn't think much of it. I figured maybe Dave had tracked in some mud when he came in earlier, though I hadn't seen him walk through the dining area. But when I looked closer, I realized the footprints were fresh. The mud was still wet, and they hadn't been there a few minutes ago. I glanced toward the front door, but it was still closed. I hadn't heard the bell above the door ring, and I hadn't seen anyone come in. The diner was small enough that I would have noticed if someone had walked through the front without me seeing. I followed the footprints with my eyes. They started at the door, made their way through the middle of the dining area, and led straight to the back, disappearing into the kitchen. My first thought was that Dave had come back in through the front, but that didn't make sense. He always used the side door near the kitchen when he went out for a smoke, and I hadn't heard him come back in. I walked to the back of the diner, following the trail of footprints. The lights in the kitchen were on, but it was quiet. I called out to Dave, but there was no answer. The kitchen was empty. I stood there for a minute, trying to figure out what was going on. The rain was still coming down hard outside, and the storm made it hard to hear much of anything over the noise. I checked the back door to see if maybe Dave had left it open, but it was locked from the inside, just like I'd left it earlier. No one could have come in that way. I was starting to get this uneasy feeling in my gut. The footprints were clear as day, and they definitely weren't mine. I hadn't been outside, and I was wearing clean sneakers. These prints were from heavy boots, like the kind a trucker or construction worker might wear. But I hadn't seen anyone come in. I grabbed a mop from the supply closet and cleaned up the muddy prints, trying to shake off the weirdness. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, or maybe Dave had come through without me noticing. I went back to the counter and sat down, waiting for the next customer. An hour passed, and I still hadn't seen or heard from Dave. The rain had let up a little, but the storm was still going strong. I decided to check outside, thinking maybe he was still out there smoking or taking a break in his car. I walked to the side door and stepped out into the rain. The parking lot was empty except for my car and Dave's beat-up old truck, parked near the back. The side of the diner was lit by a single flickering streetlight, casting long shadows across the wet asphalt. Dave wasn't out there. I stood there for a minute, listening to the rain and staring at his truck. It didn't make sense. If he'd gone somewhere, he would have taken his truck, but there it was, sitting there in the same spot it had been all night. I went back inside, feeling more uneasy than ever. I checked the kitchen again, but it was still empty. I even went into the walk-in freezer in the storage room, but there was no sign of him. It was like he'd just disappeared. I tried calling his cell, but it went straight to voicemail. At that point, I didn't know what to do. The diner was empty, and I was the only one there. I considered locking up early and leaving, but I didn't want to just ditch the place without telling anyone. Plus, I had no idea where Dave had gone. I went back to the counter and sat down, trying to keep myself calm. I figured Dave would show up eventually, and I just needed to wait it out. But then I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The muddy footprints were back. This time, they were leading from the kitchen to the front door. The same heavy boot prints, still wet, still muddy. But I hadn't heard anyone come in, and the front door was still locked. I stood up and walked over to the door, staring down at the prints. They led straight to the door, but there was no sign that anyone had opened it. I walked back to the kitchen, my heart racing. The prints were smeared slightly, like someone had walked through them again, but the kitchen was still empty. I checked the back door again, but it was locked, just like before. I stood there, staring at the empty kitchen, trying to make sense of what was happening. I was the only one in the diner, but someone had to have made those prints. Someone had to be inside, walking around, but I couldn't find them. I grabbed my phone and texted the manager, telling him that something was wrong and that I was closing up early. I wasn't about to stick around any longer. I locked the front door, grabbed my bag, and went out the side door, locking it behind me. I didn't even bother to check on Dave's truck again. I just got in my car and drove off. I never found out what happened to Dave that night. He didn't show up for his next shift, and when the manager called him, his phone was still off. The police checked his truck and the diner, but there was no sign of him. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. They said maybe he decided to leave town or take off for some reason, but I don't buy it. He wouldn't just leave without telling anyone, especially not without his truck. I quit the job a few days later. I couldn't go back to that diner, not after what happened. I still think about it sometimes, though. Those muddy footprints, the empty kitchen, and the way Dave just disappeared.
Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.